everyone, dear participants, and dear Paul. Welcome to all of you to this interactive session of the Advanced International Sports Affairs Training course this year. For this session, our speaker is Mr. Paul SALISBURY. He is the Deputy Director of the Economic and Political Section of Australian Office in Taipei. In fact, he has a dual identity. He is a diplomat, and he's also a professional road racing cyclist. I think he will introduce himself more later. Today, his topic is about sport diplomacy. It is really a very interesting topic in the sport field, and I'm honored to work with him again this year. So after his presentation, I will give several Q&A first, and then I will open the floor to all of you to have interaction with each other. So feel free after his presentation, and we can connect with each other through the internet. Okay, so let us give a big welcome to Mr. Paul for his presentation first.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for a very warm introduction. It's a real honor to be participating in this year's International Sports Affairs training course. I'm really looking forward to having the opportunity to talk to all the participants today about what I think is a really important topic, particularly at this time when we're facing a lot of challenges with COVID-19. So that's why I'm today going to be talking about not just sports diplomacy, but how we can use sports diplomacy to tackle some of the challenges that we're confronting with COVID-19. The title of my talk today is Australia's Sports Diplomacy and the Challenges of COVID-19. My name is, as Lisa said, my name is Paul SALISBURY, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Australian Office in Taipei. Next slide, please. So this is a brief outline of my talk today. I hope it'll go for about 15 minutes or so. I will give my a brief self-introduction first. Then secondly, I want to talk about what do we mean by sports diplomacy, because you may have heard the word being used a lot, but it's not often defined very well. So what do we actually understand by sports diplomacy? Then I want to introduce some of the Australian government's sports diplomacy initiatives, which include a sports diplomacy strategy 2030, which was released in 2019, and then briefly outline one of our key programs in the Pacific. So the Pacific nations, which are Australia's neighbours, are key partners for us in our sports diplomacy strategy. So I'd like to introduce a few of the examples of our initiatives in the Pacific. And then I'd like to move on to COVID and the challenges that COVID presents for sports and sports diplomacy. And then I'd like to finish off with a few points on global cooperation on vaccines and the role that governments through sports and sports diplomacy can help in order to raise awareness and improve people's understanding about the importance of vaccine. So that's the basic outline of my talk today. Thank you. And just quickly a self-introduction. So my name is Paul SALISBURY. I'm the Deputy Director of the Australian Office in Taipei. As a Deputy Director, my responsibilities cover sports diplomacy and sports collaboration. So we consider sports cooperation with Taiwan to be very important. And so that is actually one of my key duties. So I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to cooperate with the Chinese Taipei Olympic Committee up until this moment we've had the chance to do many different activities together, and this training course is one of those. So it's a very good place for Australia to be promoting sports and sports cooperation. So that's the work side. And then, as Lisa also kindly mentioned, I'm also a very keen sports person. I love sports, many different types of sports, and traveling as well. So I've been fortunate enough to be able to represent Australia in sports. So I'm the main sport that I do is cycling, and I've had the best performances in track cycling, which is what is done in a velodrome, but also road cycling. So I've competed in a number of world championships in road cycling around the world. So sport has given me an opportunity to travel, as well as being something that I really thoroughly enjoy, and it's very healthy. Cycling is a wonderful sport because you get the opportunity to travel. You can actually move around as you're doing it. So it's a wonderful way to not only keep fit but also appreciate nature and travel. So, and just one or two other things to mention was I've actually been an Australian champion in 2017 in track cycling, and also importantly, I've had the opportunity through my work to help cyclists, because cycling is my main area that I focus on, to help cyclists, Australian cyclists, to train and compete in Taiwan and Japan. So in Taiwan, they have the Tour of Taiwan every March. They didn't have it this year, but in previous years they've had that. So it's been very fortunate to be able to help Australian athletes compete in Taiwan and also in Japan. And in addition, the Japanese Olympic cycling team they do a yearly training course, which they do in Australia, because it's Australia and Japan are opposite seasons. Australia is in the southern hemisphere, so it's a very good time during the off season in Japan for athletes to travel to Australia, where they can train in the best environment. Next slide, please. So these are just a few photos to give you a brief idea of my different activities that I've been involved in cycling. So as I mentioned, the one on the far left is inside a velodrome. I've been fortunate enough to travel in road races. The photo on the bottom left is my Japanese cycling team. So I was part of it's like a semi-professional Japanese cycling team. And also I've enjoyed traveling and cycling as well. So in Taiwan, being fortunate to ride up to Wuling Pass there through Taroko Gorge, a beautiful race up there, and other races in Italy and other parts around the world. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to move on to sports diplomacy and what we understand by sports diplomacy. And I wanted to give you, this is a comment by Australia's Foreign Minister, Ms. Marise Payne. So she said, "Sport is one of Australia's great strengths and an important diplomatic asset. It provides a platform for projecting our values, building people-to-people connections, and strengthening communities." So I think the key words there is that the government sees sport as a platform for projecting values, building connections, and strengthening communities. So often we think of sport as just an athletic activity, but it's far more than that. And in terms of the world of diplomacy, it can play an important value in strengthening relations between countries. Okay, so just moving on, next slide, please. So I just thought I'd give a few examples of sports diplomacy that I think might give a clearer picture to you of what we mean when we talk about sports diplomacy. And the first example that I pulled up there was, I think it's a very interesting one, is the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And an Afro-American runner called Jesse Owens was the first Afro-American runner to win gold medals he won it in 4 events. So he won the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the 400 meter 4x4 relay, and the long jump. And he broke a number of Olympic records, and he was the star of the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Now, why is this important? Why have I raised this in the context of sports diplomacy? Well, 1936 was, at the time in Berlin, it was Nazi Germany. And this was at the height of Nazism in Germany, at a time when Hitler and the Nazi government, Jesse Owens, when he won his gold medals, it was the height of Nazi Germany. And at the time, the Nazi government was saying that the Aryan race, so people with blue eyes, blonde hair, fair skin, they were superior to everybody else. But then you had an Afro-American athlete in this very racial environment coming in and winning everything and beating all the other athletes, and he became a hero at the time, not only in obviously in the United States, but also in Germany. He was very, very popular in Germany as well. So it just sort of shows, even though the government at the time was trying to promote a particular ideology through sports, he was able to challenge that. So I think it's a very useful example. 2 other examples very quickly. The Korean unification flag at the Olympics. So that's been flown 4 times. You can see there's an image there with the 2 Korean flags, South and North Korea, and then the white flag with the blue map of Korea, unified Korea, in the middle. So that's been another instance where the image of where sports diplomacy has been very important and a very prominent, high-profile event. Then finally, just a quick mention for the IOC refugee Olympic team. So they first emerged in Rio 2016, and that's where that photo is from, in Rio de Janeiro. But at the time, there were only, I think there were 9 or 10 athletes from a number of different, the point is that they actually don't have a country that they represent because they are refugees. They've been driven out for political or other reasons. They've been driven out of their own countries, but they're still able to participate and represent the refugee Olympic team. So in Tokyo 2021, I understand there are 29 such athletes covering a number of different sports. So it's really expanded. It's a program that the International Olympic Committee has been promoting, and it's a very important sports diplomacy initiative. So that's just a few illustrations. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, I think sport, as we know, it's often talked about as a language that can break down cultural barriers, particularly with youth. So sport is something that very much appeals to young people, and it's something that transcends cultural and linguistic barriers. You can often communicate very effectively through sport, through activity, rather than through words. In addition, the values that are promoted in sport, for example, competition, teamwork, and fair play. These are values that the governments would like to promote as well, to help build trust between nations and strengthen bonds and bring people together. And also, finally, sport can also help to advance interests, project values and identities, and serve as a bridge between people, communities, and nations. I think I will mention later on in the presentation the importance that sports plays for bringing people in the Pacific Islands. For many of these people, sport is one of the most important things in their lives, and it's an effective way to communicate to them and to build bridges between different communities. So I also wanted to point out here that sport is important in promoting development, and the UN listed it in amongst its sustainable development goals that sports development is important, and particularly because it has a link to health, promoting public health. And that's where I think there's also a link to the current challenges of COVID, because often in developing countries, there are issues to do with public health, gender inequality, discrimination, social cohesion. All of these issues, these very important social issues, sport can play a role in improving people's livelihood and addressing a lot of these disadvantages. So that's why in the Australian government sports diplomacy, particularly when it's targeted at development programs in the Indo-Pacific region, sports and sports cooperation can play an important part in promoting development and public health. Australia's sports diplomacy strategy was announced in 2019, and the vision is for 2030. So I've just outlined some of the 4 key pillars of the strategy. So, of course, one thing is promoting your own sports people, Australian sport, to represent Australia globally. But also it's important to be building linkages with our neighbours. Thirdly, sport, when we think of sport, we often just think about the athletes, but as I'm sure you're all aware, sport is much bigger than that. It's a huge industry that involves lots of different people, businesses and connections. For example, for one Olympic athlete, it's often said there's usually about 30 different people involved in the team behind that person, from trainers to nutritionists, psychologists, logistics. There's so many people involved, and there's so many different businesses involved in the actual sports endeavour. And then finally, the last pillar is strengthening communities in the Indo-Pacific in particular, but not just there, it also extends beyond that. So they're the 4 key pillars of our sports diplomacy strategy. I'll just quickly now just play a short video which outlines some of the key initiatives of our sports diplomacy strategy in the Pacific. These are called in the Pacific Sports Partnership.
The first strike of the wind came to the island, pull my head, pull my leg. When my knees, I feel my knees on my chest, hit the ground. The program is give me purpose in many ways. Deep inside me, I'm so proud.
Sport has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire. It has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language they understand. Sport can create hope where once there was only despair.
Like it changes my perspective on life.
Just believe in yourself. If I can do it, you can do it.
Thank you. So that was just a very quick introduction to our Pacific Sports Partnership, which supports 13 different sports across 6 different countries. So yeah, I was just those slides were summarising the initiatives of our government in the Pacific. I know that the next part of my presentation addresses the challenges of sport and the challenges of COVID-19. So I think hopefully they can put the slides back up there again. What I can say is that COVID-19 has presented a number of challenges to sports and the sporting community and athletes that we have never seen before. It's unprecedented. And it's at a global scale. This is proving to be a real challenge for all of us, and a lot of initiatives and efforts are going into working out ways to address some of these challenges. So hopefully you can get the slides up there again, but the first slide that I have has some pictures of stadiums, and the reason why I wanted to introduce that to you was because I think it's a very good example of the ways in which people are using and businesses are using their initiative at this challenging time to work out ways to get around some of these problems. One thing I can say is that when we think of sports, we often just think of athletes or in the stadium or participating on the track. So yeah, please be aware that when we're talking about sports, we often just think about players on the field, but that's only a small part of the picture. So I don't know if you can actually see on your screens there, but there's a chart, column graph, which explains the percentages of the sports industry accounted for by different sectors. And you can see that the actual professional sports is about 23% of all global sports revenue, whereas retail accounts for 36%. Infrastructure, food and beverage and betting as well, they account for 26%. And then there's additional factors such as things like club and gym fees. So we're often, when we're thinking about sport, we're just thinking about a match taking place in a stadium or something, but there's a lot more industries and businesses involved. So the pictures that I have there, the one at the top left is at the start of COVID. So lots of sports were just cancelled and stadiums were empty. There was no one. So you have one figure sitting in the stadium there. But then if you move down to the bottom left, which is that's the Rakuten Monkeys. So that was last year, was seen as an innovative move in Taiwanese baseball to have mannequins and cardboard cutouts at these competitions. So the baseball game itself was going on, but the stands were full of cardboard cutouts and mannequins. And then the picture, the photo on the right is actually, that's in Europe this year. And you may not be able to see very clearly, but if you look closely, all of the seats in the stadium are filled by cardboard cutouts, but they're not just ordinary cardboard cutouts. Each one is actually a spectator, a fan, who has paid to have their photo stuck on the cardboard cutout. So it actually, each one of those is a fan who has paid for a seat, as it were. And they feel like they're participating in the game. So it shows ways in which businesses have evolved to develop different strategies to keep people interested in participating, feel like they're involved in sports. Next slide, please. So here's just a few examples of the ways in which sports and sports athletes have tried to cope with the challenges of COVID. So the first one is just to wear a mask. And the top photo is actually a British athlete called Chelsea Porter, who insisted, despite other athletes not wearing a mask, that she would race in the European Athletics Championships with a mask because she had concerns about COVID. And she was actually the first person to win. I don't think she won. I think she came second or third, but she medaled, podiumed, wearing a mask, competing against other athletes. So dispelling the myth that if you wear a mask, you can't do sports. So that's one example. Another popular or quite commonly used method is what are called sports bubbles or bio bubbles. So the picture underneath there is actually from India, and that's the players actually came out on the field in bubbles. But the idea is that the athletes are isolated from the rest of the community, from wherever they're participating, and they have like a barrier between them and the outside world, and inside the barrier or the bubble, they can monitor health and ensure that there's no infections occurring inside the bubble. So that's another way. Another option is relocation of sports to areas which are considered safer. So, for example, I know in Taiwan there's talk about moving the baseball league to the south of Taiwan because the north of Taiwan is considered to be, at the moment, to be not as safe as the south. In Australia, where I'm from, we have a number of different types of football, and at the moment, some of our worst COVID areas are in the south of Australia, in Melbourne, which is the centre for Australian rules football. What has happened is the games which were scheduled to play there have been relocated to Queensland in northern Australia, which is a long way away, or also to Tasmania, which is a separate island. So there's ways to actually physically separate and relocate competitions. Another option is a virtual solution. So some sports lend themselves better to virtual solutions than others. I have a picture there of cycling. As the cyclist inside a studio, you can actually compete on a computer in a virtual event. So they actually have virtual races. So that works for some sports, but not necessarily for others. And then finally, the last point I wanted to mention is vaccinations. So, and this leads me on to my my next slide. Could you please progress to the next slide, please? So all the other options that I mentioned, many of them are temporary or stopgap measures. At the moment, we're trying to address these problems. But in the long term, ultimately, I think that global cooperation on vaccines represents the best shot that we have for tackling coronavirus and the challenges that it poses for sports. And I think that athletes can play an important role in this process. So I've given a few examples there of athletes from different countries lining up to get vaccinated. I think it's important that we cooperate globally on this issue because access to vaccines is crucial. Not all athletes have the same access to vaccines. Athletes from poorer countries will face many more challenges, not just with vaccines, but also having access to safe places to train and prepare for competition. So we need to work together, and that's where governments can play an important role to cooperate through initiatives like the COVAX facility, for example, to make sure that there is equitable access to vaccines for all athletes. So it's not just going to be that some athletes who come from the rich countries are able to access vaccines and compete. It needs to be that we're working together to ensure that all athletes from all countries and refugees who don't have their own country as well, all of these people have equitable access to vaccines. Next slide, please. I just wanted to quickly, in closing, mention some of Australia's commitments to vaccine support for our Pacific neighbours. So, as I mentioned, for Australia and Australia's sports diplomacy, our neighbours are very important. So you can see on the right a number of arrows pointing to different countries near Australia. So the one on the red arrow on the far left, that's Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji. All of these countries have very, very strong sporting traditions. And they're also the targets for one of our vaccine initiatives, which is a partnership agreement with UNICEF to supply up to 6 million doses of vaccines for the Pacific and Timor-Leste in 2021. And that's in addition to Australia's commitment for 80 million Australian dollar commitment for a contribution to the COVAX facility as well. So as I mentioned, for Australia, the Pacific nations in particular are very important. Some of these nations are also very important for Taiwan. So I think that there may be also opportunities for Australia and Taiwan to work together in the future to ensure that we can help our Pacific neighbours. So that's, I realise I've probably gone a little bit over time. That's where I'd like to end my presentation with the next slide, please. Okay, thank you very much for your time, and I'm very much looking forward to speaking with Lisa and also taking questions from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you for your very clear and very insightful presentation of sports diplomacy. I think for many people, sports diplomacy may be difficult when it sounds, and it might be difficult for people to understand. But if we put it to a most simplest way, it means that sport can play an important role to connect people together, connect people from different nations and from different cultures. Just like what Chinese Taipei Olympic Committee has been advocating to maintain sports exchange to different organizations, and we would like to endeavor to build a better world through sport. Now, I would like to follow up a few questions, and then I will give the floor to all of the participants. The first one is, what are your advice on maintaining sports diplomacy during the post-pandemic phase? Here, I also have a related question from one of our audience, Fang Yu, in advance. I think Fang Yu is also on this online meeting right now. She has a similar question that the whole world has been affected by COVID-19. And as a result, she's like to ask in what kind of way we can adapt to maintain the sport diplomacy with other countries during the pandemic situation. Is there any related examples, or are there any suggestions that you might have? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, Lisa, and also Fong Yu for a very important question. I think what we first need to realize is that we're not in the I don't think we're in the post-pandemic phase. We need to realize that this is probably going to be around for a while. And so it's important to develop strategies to deal with the situation. And I think what my presentation tried to explain was that sports can actually play a part in helping us to get out of the COVID pandemic. It's not just a question of we need to wait for COVID to finish and then we can start doing sports again. We can actually use sports as a vehicle to help promote strategies that will get us out of COVID. Okay, that's what I've tried to introduce through the notion of our partnerships with Pacific nations. Sport and health are very closely related. So, for example, in being able to get people to access vaccines, people who are participating in sports programs, who are actively involved, we can use those communication channels to be able to get people interested and focused on the importance of getting vaccinated. So firstly, it's a way to get vaccines to people and also a way to encourage people to take an interest in getting vaccinated. So I think that sport and public health are very closely linked, and that I don't think it's a question of waiting until we get out of this situation and then trying to do something. I think we actually can use sports as a tool now to help us address some of these challenges. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And I think, as you mentioned, sport can bring us, sport represents passion and represents inspiration. And I think it is really what we really need, especially at this moment during this pandemic. And you also mentioned about the salient example of sports diplomacy, which is the Olympic Games. You mentioned about the IOC refugee team and also the Korean unification team in the Pyeongchang 2018. And so my next question is related to the Olympic Games. We understand that the Australian women's softball is the first team to arrive in Japan this time. I'm just wondering, do people in Australia have different opinions during the circumstances of this global pandemic to take part in the upcoming Tokyo Olympics? And how does the Australian government deal with those disputes, if it has? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lisa. It's a very important question, and I think you touched on a very good point earlier on, where at the moment there's a lot of frustration and despair in the world, and I think that the values that are promoted through the Olympics can play an important role in helping people to overcome a lot of the frustrations that they're experiencing at the moment. So that's why, putting the Olympics aside for a moment, in Australia, sport is a very important part of our culture. And when people can't participate in sports, particularly things like football, which is very big in Australia, football, cricket, swimming, these sorts of things, it causes a lot of problems for people who feel like they're isolated, can't be part of the community. Many people are very passionate about their teams, very passionate supporters. So sport and supporting sports is an important part of their lives. So with the Tokyo Olympics, I think we need to distinguish between people watching from Australia, because obviously the Olympics are not in Australia, and people in Japan, where the Olympics are going to be held, because I can very much appreciate there is a lot of concern with the people in Japan about the risks involved in hosting the event. And watching that from Australia, watching that on TV is very different. So I think it's important to distinguish between, by saying the support for the Olympics in Australia may be very different to the support for the Olympics in Japan. But for Australia, I think there's been very strong support for our athletes to participate, knowing that many of them have spent many years preparing for this event, and it's probably the highlight of their career. So they are very much strongly supported by of course by the government, but also I think by the vast majority of people in Australia to participate. It's a question of how the actual games will be involved, how they will be run themselves, and that's very much a question for the Japanese government and the organisers and the IOC. But in Australia, certainly by our athletes being able to participate in the games this time, there's a lot of excitement and expectation, and there's a lot of support. So, as I said, the Australian athletes feel the vast majority feel very strongly supported by the people back home.
Right. As you mentioned, this edition of Olympic Games is really a unique one. And for example, our Chinese Taipei Olympic Committee, we are now in a very intense phase of preparation for the Tokyo 2020. I think it is indeed a very difficult decision by the organizing committee and also by the IOC, how to find a balance and keep the balance among the different factors, including the benefits of the Olympic Games, all the efforts put in by the athletes, and also human security. So it's really a difficult decision to be made. But of course, we are now in our preparation work, and it's really an intense one because we have to put much more efforts due to the countermeasures set by the organizing committee. So our work is more than before, but we hope that the Olympic Games can bring people around the world hope, especially during this difficult time. Okay, now I think we should open the floor to our audience. I wonder if there are any audience who have any questions related to sports diplomacy, or maybe any topics related to Taiwan and Australia relationship. If you can raise your hand and I can see you. And okay, I think I see Pei Wei Fang, right?
Yes, it's me. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Please go forward.
Hello, Salisbury, and I'm Pei Wei Fang from National Taiwan Normal University. I'm studying a master's degree now. And thank you for your informative and detailed presentation. And also in your presentation, you mentioned 3 to 4 goals for Australia's in 2030 about diplomatic strategies. And one of them is to train our athletes better so that these athletes can provide greater exposure or publicity by making good remarks at the international competitions. And the other is what I am more curious about is to build out a linkage with our neighbors. Because in your presentation, you mentioned about Australia's donation of vaccines to the Pacific neighbors. But as far as I'm concerned, Taiwan is also now running short of vaccines. So there's not much that we can do about this situation. But I would like to also maybe you can share with us, and from your perspective and your understanding of Taiwan, what else advantage sports or events maybe we can do some adjustments to maybe for Taiwan to take better advantage to build out a friendship with our neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you, Pan Wei Fang. That was excellent questions. I'm very I'm glad that you liked the presentation, and I think that the 2 questions that you raised are really really good ones. Firstly, in terms of empowering athletes to represent Australia globally, I think when I say athletes, we also know that in sports and sports administration, there's not only athletes but other people involved, and the Australian government has been taking an active role in training people to become leaders in the sporting field. So, for example, when you talk about athletes representing or presenting a good image for your country, or presenting a good image for Taiwan or Australia internationally, a lot of that is actually like being able to train people to become leaders. Often what happens with many athletes is they're very talented as sports people, but they're not necessarily talented in presenting themselves to an audience. So often when they have a microphone thrust in front of them, they don't know what to say, or they just say the same thing. But actually helping people and training them, like how to do media management, like what sort of image do you want to present? What people do you want to communicate that message to? This is important sort of training that I think we can help our athletes, and also help to build the teams around the athletes. So that's, yeah, in relation to your first question. The second question, building linkages with neighbours. I appreciate the vaccine situation in Taiwan is very tight at the moment. Hopefully in the future, because we have to think about this in terms of the long term. So Australia is starting to produce its own vaccines as well. That's AstraZeneca vaccines made in Australia, and most of those are being donated to our neighbours. So that's an example of like where this is a long-term strategy. It's not something that is going to be resolved in the next month or so. But even still, I think it is important, and there are many things that Taiwan can do to build linkages. I mentioned, for example, helping athletes to train in your country, or for example, I mentioned the example of because of the northern-southern hemisphere difference, cyclists from the northern hemisphere are able to come to Australia and train in Australia. So I would imagine, for example, that there are many of Taiwan's friends and allies in the Pacific, places like Palau, Nauru, right? Federated States of Micronesia. These places, Tuvalu, right? They have very, very poor infrastructure. The sports people from these places do not have a lot of opportunities to train. They would love to be able to come to Taiwan and be able to practice in really good facilities, right? Taiwan is a world leader in a number of sports, right? And so you can help, and it might not necessarily be the sports themselves. For example, sports medicine or like sports psychology or nutrition, right? You can develop courses to train people from these countries. They'll come to Taiwan to learn about sports, the sports industry, sports practice. Then they can go back to their country, use that knowledge and support their athletes. So I think there's many opportunities for Taiwan to strengthen its connections with its neighbours. I hope that answers your question, Pan Wei Fan.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we still have one question from Pan Jianzhang.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
Okay. Hello. My name is Pan Jianzhang, and you can call me Ethan. I'm from Monash University, Australia, but obviously I'm Taiwanese. Okay. So my question is, as you mentioned about, maybe the strategy we can do is training our athlete and make them as a leader, or we can make more connection with the Asia Pacific countries. So my question is how we can do as an individual. What I mean is, as all the participants here, how we can do to help this kind of topics as an individual, not an athlete, but as the person who really cared about the like a linkage or like the athlete or like a sport of Taiwan. If we are the individual, how kind of thing we can do to help this kind of topic. This is my question, and thanks for your sharing. I really fields that you're sharing is really inspired and make us have a lot of thinking about how we can really do to help Taiwan. So this is my question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jianzhang, Ethan. It's an excellent question. And I think it also sort of touches on one of the key parts of sports diplomacy, because it's actually, when it comes down to it, sports diplomacy is about people-to-people links. Mm-hmm. It's not about one country or a nation and another. It's not that. It's actually people communicating with one another, and they are individuals, right? So a lot of the initiatives that Australia is trying to promote, when I say Australia, the Australian government is trying to promote, are community connections, right? A lot of that can be done at the individual level. There's lots of different organizations, NGOs that are working at this level to promote grassroots connections. So I really want to try and stress that it's not when I say I work for the Australian government, but ultimately the people who are important, who matter in sports diplomacy, are the people on the ground, the people who have the grassroots connection and actually working in communities, right? So I think even as an individual, you have many opportunities to be able to promote those types of connections. And it could be professionally, like, for example, if you're working in the sports field, you may have the opportunity to have professional connections with other people in your field. But it could also be at a personal level, like if you like doing a particular sport, for example, right? There are opportunities for you to communicate, to reach out to people in other organizations and communities to help set up these connections. So it's not something that's something that's necessarily done at the government to government level. It's often people like you who want to actually make a difference, reaching out, taking the initiative, and making a change. And that's often how these things start, right? So it's not actually like the government from the top down saying, we have to do this. It's actually people thinking, hey, there's something that we can do. And then ultimately the government should be trying to facilitate that. But it very much depends on those people to people, those grassroots links. So I still think, that there's a lot that individuals can do, and the role of individuals is very important. It's a key part of the process.
Thanks. Really inspired. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for our participants and Mr. Paul. My colleague is reminding me that we have to keep on time for this session because we still have another one and the lecture might be on the line waiting. So we have to close the Q&A session. But before we conclude this meeting, can we ask Mr. Paul to give us any advice on our participants who might be interested in involving international sports affairs or who are interested in advocating for sports representation for Taiwan?
Yeah, no, thank you, Lisa, and thanks again for having the opportunity to participate today. It's been really fantastic to hear a number of different views from participants, including in Australia. I was very happy to hear that. But also in Taiwan and other parts as well. I think it's been a fantastic opportunity. Hello? Hello?
Yes.
Sorry. Yes, I think it's been a fantastic opportunity today. I did want to say just in closing that I do think that the sports industry and people involved, maybe many people of the participants today are involved in sports degrees, sports diplomas, who in the future would like to be working in the sports industry. I think that sports, particularly for Taiwan, can play an important role in the future. And I think that sports diplomacy is, as I've tried to highlight through my presentation, is one way in which we can really connect with not just with our neighbours, but with the world more generally. Taiwan faces a number of different issues on the global stage. It's not easy to be able to speak with a strong voice, but I think that sports is one area in particular where the people of Taiwan can speak with a very strong voice and very much present a very good image of Taiwan and what it means to be Taiwanese. So I'm very much looking forward to Taiwanese athletes participating in the Tokyo Olympics. I know that the Chinese Taipei Olympic Committee is doing a lot of work behind the scenes to make it all happen. But I think what we'll be able to see through the Olympics is an opportunity for Taiwanese athletes to convey to the world about what it means to be Taiwanese. And I think that's a really, really valuable tool that all of the people who are participating today have the opportunity to use going forward. So I hope that that gives you some words of encouragement, and I wish you all the best in your studies and your future careers.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your excellent sharing. I invite all of us to open the microphone and give a very big round of applause. Thank you for Paul's sharing for this session.